The night Jonas Ellsworth walked into the Dusty Rose Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1883, he had not intended to ask anyone to dance, and he most certainly had not intended to fall in love. He had ridden in from the prairie with the last of the September sun at his back, his horse lathered and tired from the long drive up from the Texas Panhandle, his body carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that does not come from one day's work, but from 11 years of days strung together without rest, without warmth, without anything that might be called a life outside of cattle and sky, and the long empty miles between one town and the next. He was 34 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with broad shoulders that had carried more than their share of burdens and hands rough enough to suggest he had never once taken the easy road when a harder one was available. His hair was dark brown with threads of early gray at the temples, and his eyes were the color of good river water, a clear, quiet blue that women had noticed before and that he had spent years pretending not to know. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, a town that had seen its share of rough men and rougher nights, a cattle boomtown where money changed hands fast and fortunes shifted with the season. The streets were wide and muddy from an afternoon rain, and the oil lamps along the main thoroughfare threw amber light across the storefronts and hitching posts, and the general human noise of a Saturday evening. There was a barber shop and a dry goods store and a hotel of modest reputation, and at the far end of the street, the Dusty Rose, which was the kind of establishment that tried very hard to be respectable and succeeded about half the time. There was a proper bar along one wall, a piano in the corner played by a stooped older man named Clarence who had lost 2 fingers on his right hand, but played with remarkable speed regardless, and a dance floor of rough-hewn planks that had been polished by the boots of 1,000 cowboys over the years, until they gleamed like dull bronze in the lamplight. Jonas tied his horse at the rail outside the livery and walked the length of the street to the Dusty Rose, because he needed a drink, and because the hotel was full, some cattle buyer from Wichita had taken every room, and because the saloon was warm and the prairie at night in late September was not. He pushed through the batwing doors without ceremony, found himself a space at the end of the bar, ordered a whiskey he had not yet decided whether he deserved, and turned his back on the room in the way of a man who has spent so many years alone that solitude has become a reflex rather than a choice. He was on his second whiskey when he heard her laugh. It was not a gentle laugh or a polite one. It was full-throated and genuine, the kind of laugh that happens before a person can stop it, and it cut right through the noise of the saloon, through Clarence's piano, and the clatter of boots on the dance floor, and the low roar of a dozen conversations, and landed somewhere in the center of Jonas Ellsworth's chest like a stone dropped into still water. He turned before he could think about turning. She was standing near the far end of the bar, a little apart from the main crowd, talking to a woman he did not know who was clearly her friend, and she was laughing at something that had just been said between them. She was perhaps 27 or 28, with brown hair, the color of autumn wheat pinned up in a practical style that was nevertheless coming slightly loose on one side, as though the evening had gotten the better of her careful arrangement. She wore a dress of deep green wool that was good quality but not extravagant, and her face was the kind of face that does not announce itself immediately as beautiful but rather reveals itself gradually, like a landscape scene from a moving train. The more you look, the more there is to see. She had high cheekbones and a generous mouth and dark eyes that, even from across a noisy saloon, gave the impression of extraordinary intelligence, and, underneath the laughter, something older and quieter that Jonas recognized without being able to name. He told himself he was not staring, and then continued to stare for another full minute before he looked away. He learned her name from the bartender, a heavy-set man called Pete who had been working the Dusty Rose for 6 years and knew every name in town worth knowing. Adelaide Wilcox. She had come to Caldwell the previous spring with her young daughter from somewhere in Missouri, a widow of 3 years following the death of her husband from a fever that had swept through their county and taken him in a week. She had a small house on the eastern edge of town and worked 3 mornings a week at the dry goods store, and the rest of the time managed on the money her late husband had left, which was not a great deal but was enough, at least for now. She was, Pete said with the casual authority of a man who dispenses information with the same ease as drinks, well regarded in town, kept to herself mostly. Did not come into the saloon very often, but sometimes on Saturday evenings came in with her friend Martha Greer for an hour or two, which was entirely respectable since the Dusty Rose was the only place in Caldwell with a piano, and Adelaide Wilcox, according to Pete, loved music more than she loved most things in the world. Jonas nodded at all of this as though he were gathering practical information, rather than drinking it in with a hunger that surprised him badly. He finished his third whiskey and was about to order a fourth when Clarence on the piano shifted from a slow waltz into something brighter and more demanding, a reel that had the couples on the floor laughing and scrambling to keep up, and Jonas watched Adelaide Wilcox's face change. She stopped talking mid-sentence to her friend. Her head turned toward the piano and her whole expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile yet, but was everything that comes before one, a kind of radiant readiness, an openness, and she closed her eyes for just a moment as though she were listening to something that lived beneath the music rather than in it. Jonas Ellsworth set down his glass. He had not asked a woman to dance in 11 years. The last time had been in the autumn of 1872, in a town not much different from this one, in a life that felt so distant now it might have belonged to someone else entirely. He had been 23 and full of the particular recklessness of youth, and he had asked a girl named Clara Hennessy to dance at a harvest celebration, and she had said yes, and they had danced 3 dances, and he had thought that was the beginning of something. And it had been the beginning of something, a courtship, a promise, a wedding date set for the following May. And then, the following April, Clara Hennessy had died of a riding accident, thrown from a horse on a clear cold morning while he had been out working the range, and when they had carried her back into town, she had already been gone, and Jonas Ellsworth had gone with her in every way that counted. He had not asked a woman to dance since then. He had told himself for years that it was because he was busy, because the cattle drives were long, because there was always another season to get through and another town to pass through and another day that needed doing. But he knew, in the honest part of himself that he visited rarely and carefully, that it was because asking a woman to dance was a declaration of a certain kind of willingness, a willingness to be seen, to step towards someone, to leave yourself open, and that willingness had dried up in him like a streambed in a drought summer, and he had not found it again. Until, apparently, tonight, in Caldwell, Kansas, in a saloon that was trying its best to be respectable. Because of a laugh he had heard across a crowded room, he pushed off from the bar. He crossed the saloon floor with the same deliberate, unhurried stride he used for everything, for crossing a pasture, for approaching a nervous horse, for navigating the particular social terrain of cattle towns where moving too fast or too slow could mean trouble. He was aware, as he moved, of how long it had been since he had done anything like this, of the stiffness in the gesture, the rust on the machinery. But he kept moving because stopping would have been worse. Adelaide Wilcox saw him coming when he was about 6 feet away. She had very quick eyes, and she was not the kind of woman who missed things happening in her vicinity. She said something quiet to her friend Martha, who glanced over and then looked back at Adelaide with an expression that Jonas could not read from his angle, and then he was standing in front of her, and it was too late to do anything but speak. "Good evening," he said. His voice came out steadier than he had expected. "My name is Jonas Ellsworth. I've been riding the trail for 6 weeks and I just got into town tonight, and I know I'm a stranger and you don't owe me the time of day. But that's a fine piece of music Clarence is playing, and it seems a waste not to dance to it. Would you do me the honor?" Adelaide Wilcox looked at him for a long moment. She did not look startled or flattered or any of the things he might have expected. She looked thoughtful, which was somehow more unnerving than either. She looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes, and she made some private calculation, and then she said, quite clearly and without unkindness, "No, thank you." The air went out of Jonas Ellsworth in a way that would have embarrassed him if he had let it show, and he did not let it show, and he did something else instead. He laughed. It came up from somewhere genuine, low and surprised, and it was out before he could have stopped it even if he had wanted to, which he didn't. Because the thing was, and he understood this in the moment of the laugh with perfect clarity, her refusal was so forthright, so calmly delivered, so absolutely without artifice or performance, that it was almost refreshing. He had expected hesitation or apology or perhaps a gentle redirection. He had gotten a clean, honest no, and there was something in that honesty that made him feel, for the first time in a long time, that he was talking to a real person. He said, still with the last of the laugh in his voice, "Fair enough. What if I asked again, though, just to give us both a second chance at the question?" Adelaide blinked. Her friend Martha made a small sound beside her that might have been a suppressed smile. Adelaide looked at him again, that same measured look, but something in it had shifted now, something fractionally warmer or fractionally more curious. Some door that had been firmly closed had opened perhaps a quarter of an inch. "You're asking again," she said. It was not quite a question. "If you'd allow it," he said. "I figure the first answer was good information. Maybe the second one will be different. If not, I'll go back to my end of the bar and not bother you further, and you'll have my word on that." Another pause. Clarence was playing something with a good rolling rhythm now, and the dancers on the floor behind Jonas were laughing and turning, and the lamplight was warm, and Adelaide Wilcox was looking at this trail-worn stranger with his clear blue eyes and his unexpected laugh, and something shifted the rest of the way. Some private scale tipped toward a conclusion she may not have planned. "All right," she said. "Yes." The word hit him somewhere below the sternum. He offered his hand and she took it, and the first thing he noticed was that her grip was firm and unsentimental, the grip of a woman who had been doing things for herself for long enough that she no longer remembered how to be tentative about it. The second thing he noticed was that she was a very good dancer. She was not showy about it. She did not perform her dancing the way some women did, making it a display. She simply moved with the music with a naturalness that suggested it was the most obvious thing in the world, and she expected her partner to keep up, which Jonas managed after the first awkward 8 bars with a kind of muscle memory he had not known he still possessed. They settled into the rhythm together, and it was, he would think about this later, lying awake in the hotel room he finally secured after the cattle buyer took a different one. It was the most uncomplicated pleasure he had felt in longer than he could accurately measure. "You said you've been on the trail 6 weeks, she said. She spoke at a normal volume, not leaning in close, trusting the music to give them their own private space within the noise of the room. "6 weeks north from Texas," he said. "Trail boss for a drive out of the Panhandle. 1,500 head, 12 men. We delivered the herd to the stock yards in Wichita 3 days ago. And then you came south to Caldwell instead of north to Wichita. I came south because a man I trust told me there was good land going cheap east of here, and I've been thinking for some years about putting down roots." She tilted her head slightly. "And are you the kind of man who follows through on what he's been thinking, or just the kind who thinks it?" He looked at her. The dance brought them close and then moved them apart and then close again, and in the close moments he could see the precise shade of her eyes, very dark brown, almost black, with a brightness in them that suggested a lively inner life. "I'm working on becoming the first kind," he said honestly. Something in her expression acknowledged this, neither approving nor disapproving, simply noting it. "Adelaide Wilcox," she said, which was not the introduction he expected but which he appreciated because it meant she was treating this as an equal exchange rather than waiting to be discovered. "I know," he said, and then added quickly because he did not want to seem odd, "the bartender told me your name. I asked before I came over." That was either prudent or peculiar. Probably both, he admitted. The ghost of a smile crossed her face and then retreated, but it had been there. He had seen it. They danced through Clarence's reel and halfway into the slower piece that followed before Adelaide gently disengaged, not abruptly but with a kind of natural conclusion, the way a sentence ends on the right word. "Thank you, Mr. Ellsworth," she said. "Jonas," he said, "please." A brief consideration. "Jonas, then, thank you for the dance." She paused. "I should tell you that I don't generally dance with strangers. I'm glad I made an exception tonight." He said very carefully, because he could feel how much depended on the exact weight of what he said next. "So am I." She held his gaze for a moment longer than courtesy required, and then she turned and walked back to her friend Martha. And Jonas Ellsworth stood in the middle of the dusty rose saloon floor, feeling as though the ground had very subtly shifted beneath him, the way it does after an earthquake that is too small to break anything but large enough to remind you that the solid world is not as solid as it seems. He went back to the bar and ordered a final whiskey and did not drink it, just held the glass and thought about the way she moved and the way she spoke, and the way she had said no with such calm certainty, and then yes with the same. And he understood that he was in a great deal of trouble of a kind he had not been in for 11 years, and could not entirely bring himself to mind. Over the next several days, Jonas did not go looking for Adelaide Wilcox, which was both a matter of principle and a matter of strategy, the two being, in his experience, often the same thing. He was in Caldwell for practical purposes. He had spoken to a land agent named Hartley Oakes on the Monday following his arrival, a thin, nervous man with an impressive mustache and an even more impressive capacity for talking, who had shown him 3 parcels of land east of town and 1 to the north. The eastern parcels were good rolling grassland with reasonable water access from a creek that ran year-round, and Jonas walked every acre of each one, with the patience of a man who has made enough bad decisions in his life to understand that the cure for a bad decision is almost never a faster one. He stayed at the hotel, a narrow 2-story affair called the Caldwell House, where the rooms were small but clean, and the breakfast served downstairs each morning was substantial enough to fuel a morning's work. He ate breakfast each day at the long common table with whoever happened to be their other travelers, local merchants, a cattle buyer from Abilene named Brinkman who was passing through, and on the 3rd morning he looked up from his eggs and biscuits to find Adelaide Wilcox standing in the doorway of the dining room. She was not there for him. He understood this immediately from the way she looked around the room with a general searching expression, rather than the specific one of a person who has come to find a particular someone. She was looking for the hotel proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Hendricks, whom she had apparently come to see about a bolt of calico that Mrs. Hendricks had ordered from the dry goods store, and which Adelaide had brought over in a wrapped parcel under her arm. But their eyes met across the dining room in the moment before Adelaide located Mrs. Hendricks, and Jonas stood up from the table because that was what a man did, and Adelaide stopped, and they both paused in the particular suspended moment of 2 people who have had one unexpectedly significant encounter and are now trying to determine the weight of it in plain daylight. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. A brief pause, and then, with a directness that he was already beginning to understand was simply her natural mode of address. "Are you still looking at land?" "I'm looking at 3 parcels east of town," he said. "I walked the middle one yesterday, and I'm going back to the north one this afternoon." "The Carver Creek parcel," she said. "That's what Hartley Oakes calls it. The creek runs all year, but it floods in the spring sometimes. You want to know that before you bought." He looked at her with a new attentiveness. "You know the land out there?" "I ride east sometimes," she said simply. "My husband and I used to talk about buying land out that way before." The before carried a weight that she did not dwell on and did not hide. He respected both choices. "I appreciate knowing about the flooding," he said. "Genuinely," she nodded. "Good luck with it," she said, and then Mrs. Hendricks appeared from the back hallway and Adelaide turned to her business, and Jonas sat back down and finished his breakfast and thought about the fact that she had not needed to stop and tell him about the flooding, and she had stopped and told him anyway. The north parcel, the Carver Creek parcel, turned out to be beautiful. Even with the knowledge of the spring flooding, which Hartley Oaks confirmed somewhat reluctantly when pressed, the land was extraordinary by the standards of the Kansas prairie. A long rolling stretch of grass, with a good stand of cottonwoods along the creek, and a low hill to the north that would block the worst of the winter wind, and enough acreage to run 300 head comfortably, and 600 if the spring had been wet enough. There was an existing structure on the property, a two-room house built by the previous owner who had left the territory 4 years ago, and while the house needed work, the roof over the back room had partially given way, and there was a section of the east wall where the timber had rotted. The structure of it was sound, and a man with Jonas's experience could put it right over the course of a winter. He bought it. He signed the papers in Hartley Oaks' office on a Thursday afternoon and walked out into the September sun as a landowner for the first time in his life, and the feeling was so strange and so large that he had to stand in the middle of the street for a full minute just to let it settle. He saw Adelaide Wilcox that afternoon, not by design, but because Caldwell was not a large town and its streets were only so wide. She was coming out of the dry goods store where she worked, pulling on her gloves and settling her hat against an evening wind that had picked up from the northwest, and she nearly walked directly into him. "I bought the Carver Creek parcel," he said before he could decide whether or not to say it. She looked up at him. The wind moved a loose strand of her hair across her cheek and she pushed it aside with the back of her wrist. "The flooded one," she said. "The beautiful one," he said, "with the cottonwoods. I'll build the house up another 1.5 feet above grade on the creek side. It'll manage the flooding." A pause. Then something in her expression did what he was learning to watch for, that fractional shift, like light moving through water, that meant she had formed an opinion she was deciding whether to share. "That's a sensible solution," she said. "I thought so. A beat." "Miss Wilcox, Adelaide, I wonder if I could ask you something that isn't about land or flooding." She waited. She was very still when she was waiting, he noticed. Not tense but genuinely patient, the kind of patience that has been built rather than inherited. "There's a church social on Saturday evening," he said. "Mrs. Hendricks mentioned it at breakfast. I'm told there's music and supper and it's entirely respectable." "It is," Adelaide said. "I usually take my daughter." "I'd be glad for you to bring her," he said, "if you'd consider coming." Another pause, longer than the previous ones, and Jonas had learned enough in the past week to wait it out rather than fill it. "Her name is Rosie," Adelaide said finally. "She's 5 years old and she is not always well behaved at social events. I've managed 1,500 cattle and 12 cowboys over 6 weeks, Jonas said. I expect I can handle a 5-year-old. The smile that crossed Adelaide's face then was not the ghost of a smile he had seen before. It was real and full, and it changed everything about her face in a way that landed on Jonas Ellsworth with the force of a physical blow. "All right," she said, for the second time in his experience of her. "Yes." The church social was held in the meeting hall beside the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, a building that smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, and the particular faint sweetness of candle wax. Someone had strung paper lanterns along the rafters, and they gave the room a warm amber light that was kinder than lamplight. And there were long tables set with food that the ladies of the congregation had been preparing since Thursday morning: roast chicken and corn bread and preserves, and 3 kinds of pie. And a fiddle player named Cal Dawson and his son with a guitar playing in the corner, with rather more enthusiasm than skill, but a great deal of enjoyable energy. Jonas arrived early, out of the nerves of a man who cannot stand waiting and so prefers to already be in place before the waiting begins. He wore clean clothes he had taken from his saddlebag, a dark shirt and his better trousers, his good boots, his hat brushed, and stood near the door in the way of someone trying to look natural about standing near the door. Adelaide came in 20 minutes later with a small girl on her hand who had her mother's dark eyes and her own entirely individual notion of how to conduct herself in public, which involved immediately detaching from her mother's hand and going directly to examine the pie table with the seriousness of a scientist. Adelaide caught Jonas's eye across the room, and the small involuntary lift of her eyebrow communicated both apology and amusement, and Jonas crossed the room to meet them. He crouched down to Rosie's eye level, which the child regarded with grave suspicion. "That's an excellent pie table," he said. "I've seen a lot of pie tables in my time, and this is a good one." Rosie looked at him. She had a round, solemn face and a blue ribbon in her dark hair that was already coming undone. "There are 3 kinds," she said importantly. "There are apple, I think, and something with berries. What's the third?" Rosie investigated. "Custard," she reported. "Custard is the best kind," he said. Rosie looked at him with reassessed regard. "Yes," she said. He stood back up. Adelaide was watching this exchange with an expression he could not fully decipher, but which made something warm and careful happen in his chest. The evening was, in the specific and uncomplicated way of evenings that become important in retrospect, nearly perfect. They ate supper at the long table, and Adelaide's friend Martha Greer was there with her husband Thomas, a carpenter with calloused hands and an easy laugh, who took immediately to Jonas with the directness of a man who trusts his instincts. And the conversation moved naturally from land to cattle to the town itself, to the wider world beyond the cattle business changing, the railroad pushing in, the old trail days winding down as the settlements thickened and the fences went up. Jonas talked more that evening than he could remember talking in years. Adelaide asked good questions, precise ones, the kind that reveal the listener's intelligence as much as the speaker's, and listened to the answers with complete attention. And when she offered her own thoughts, it was with a quiet confidence that had nothing defensive or aggressive in it, just the straightforward authority of a person who knows what she thinks and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Rosie ate an enormous amount of custard pie and fell asleep against Jonas's arm 2 hours into the evening with the sudden totality of small children, and he held her there without remark and without awkwardness, with the careful stillness of a man holding something precious and borrowed. And Adelaide looked at her sleeping daughter, and then at Jonas, and something shifted between them that was quieter and deeper than anything that had shifted before. When they walked out at the end of the evening, Thomas and Martha heading one way, Jonas walking Adelaide and the sleeping Rosie home in the other direction, because it would have been unthinkable not to. The town was quiet and cold under a sky full of stars, and the dry, sweet smell of prairie autumn was everywhere. At the door of Adelaide's small house, with Rosie drowsy and heavy on her shoulder, Adelaide said, "Thank you, Jonas." "It was my pleasure," he said, and meant it in the absolute and unembellished sense. "Rosie liked you," she said. "She doesn't like most people." "I'm honored," he said. "I liked her too." A pause, the kind of pause that is full rather than empty. "I should get her inside," Adelaide said. "Of course." He stepped back. Then, "Adelaide, I'd like to call on you if that would be all right. Properly, I mean. Not by accident." She looked at him in the starlight, and he could not quite read her face in the darkness, but he thought he was fairly sure that the expression was not an unwilling one. "I'd like that," she said. "Come to supper on Sunday if you'd like. I'll cook." He said he would, and she went inside, and he walked back to his hotel and lay awake for a long time listening to the town settle around him, and thinking that he had been in Caldwell, Kansas, for less than 2 weeks, and had signed papers on land and been asked to Sunday supper by the most interesting woman he had encountered in more than a decade, and that his hands were not shaking, but they wanted to. He rode out to the Carver Creek property on the Friday and Saturday before Sunday supper. He walked the house again in the autumn light, making notes about what needed doing: the roof first, then the east wall, then the floor in the back room where the rot had crept in from the water damage. The cottonwoods along the creek were turning yellow and gold in the cold air, and they reflected in the still water of the creek in long wavering lines, and Jonas stood on the bank and let himself, for the first time in a very long time, imagined the property in a future tense. Smoke from the chimney in January. A kitchen garden in the spring if a person were inclined toward gardens. The sound of the creek in summer. The possibility of children's voices, distant and clear across the grass. He stopped himself there, because he was getting entirely ahead of himself, and he was not the kind of man to let imagination outrun what was real. What was real was Sunday supper, and a woman he had danced with once and met 4 times. But the cottonwoods were very beautiful in the cold golden light, and the creek ran clear and year-round, flooding aside, and he let himself stand there a little longer before he went back to work. Sunday supper at Adelaide's house was revelatory, not in a dramatic way, but in the slow accumulating way of something that keeps showing you more the closer you get to it. The house was small, 2 rooms, a parlor and kitchen combined and a bedroom beyond, but it was carefully kept and smelled of wood polish and cinnamon, and Adelaide moved in the kitchen with an efficient grace that made it clear she had been doing for herself for long enough that it had become a kind of art. She made roast beef and potatoes and bread baked that morning, and Rosie sat at the table and told Jonas in comprehensive detail about her school lessons and a particular chicken she had named General who lived in the yard behind the house and had strong opinions about her neighbors. "General is very territorial," Adelaide said dryly from the stove, and Jonas laughed. "That's a presidential quality," he said seriously to Rosie. "She's a general, not a president," Rosie corrected, with the gravity of someone for whom this distinction matters. "Of course," he said. "My mistake." After supper and after Rosie had been read to and put to bed by her mother with a thoroughness that Jonas admired from the doorway of the parlor, 2 full stories and a song, the whole process managed with a patience that struck him as extraordinary. Adelaide came back and sat at the table with a cup of coffee, and he sat across from her, and the house was quiet around them except for the wind outside and the small sounds of the wood settling. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said, which was a characteristically precise thing to say. "Why did you say no, the first time, at the saloon?" He paused. "You don't have to answer." She considered for a moment, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "Because I didn't know you," she said, "and because I've spent 3 years being careful. After Thomas died, her late husband had been named Thomas. He had learned since. I found out that being careful is the only thing that keeps everything from becoming very difficult. Rosie needed that from me, she still does. And now," he said quietly, she looked up from her coffee. "And now you're the man who bought the Carver Creek parcel and talked about building the house up above the floodline, and who sat with my daughter all evening at the church social without once making her feel like a complication." A pause. "So now I'm a little less careful, just a little." He held her gaze across the table, and the October night pressed against the windows, and the lamp burned between them, and Jonas Ellsworth thought, "Here. This is the thing I have been going without for 11 years and did not let myself know I was going without it until this very moment in this very kitchen in this very small house in Caldwell, Kansas, and now that I know I cannot be comfortable with not knowing again." He said, "I want to court you, Adelaide. I want to be clear about that. Not casually. I'm not passing through. I bought that land. I'm going to build on it. I want you to know what I mean." The quiet in the kitchen had a quality to it after he said that of something carefully held. "I know what you mean," she said. And then, after a moment, "I think I'd like that, if you give me time to be sure." "All the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." He rode back to his hotel in the cold dark with the stars overhead and the prairie spreading out on either side of the road, and he had the sensation of a man who has stepped off a cliff, and instead of falling has found something solid beneath his feet, something he had not known was there. Over the weeks that followed, Jonas split his time between the Carver Creek property and the town. He began work on the roof immediately. There was urgency there before the hard cold came, and he worked with a steady, focused energy that the labor itself appreciated, as though the house responded to the attention by standing a little straighter. He hired 2 men from town to help with the heavier work. A young man named Billy Prout, barely 18 and eager in the way that youth is eager before the world has had time to moderate it, and an older German carpenter named Friedrich Holst, who had been in Kansas since 1869, and whose skill with timber was the kind of skill that comes from decades of loving a trade. Between the three of them, the roof was done within the first 2 weeks of October and the east wall repaired by the third, and Jonas stood back and looked at the house on a cold, clear afternoon, and felt a satisfaction so specific and physical that he was not sure he had a word for it. He called on Adelaide twice a week, on Wednesday evenings and Sunday afternoons, which they had arrived at organically rather than by arrangement, the way good habits form. He brought small things sometimes, not extravagant gifts because Adelaide would have been uncomfortable with extravagance, but small things. A book he had found at the dry goods store that she had mentioned once in passing, a piece of good ribbon for Rosie, a small wooden horse that Friedrich had carved for the child during a slow hour on the worksite, and that Rosie received with a solemnity of joy that was almost painful to watch. Adelaide saw the ribbon being given to Rosie and looked at Jonas and said nothing, but the look said everything that needed saying. Their conversations deepened the way creek water deepens moving downstream, gradually, inevitably, by the logic of the terrain. She told him about Missouri and about her childhood, a farm family with 3 older brothers, and a father who had believed firmly in education for all his children, which was why Adelaide could read and figure and think clearly about the world around her, skills she had at first simply taken for granted, and then come to understand, as she grew older and moved through the world, as gifts that were not universal. She had married Jonas Wilcox at 22, not for love exactly but for solid regard and genuine friendship, and the belief that these things could grow into something warmer, and they had grown, by the end, into something that was not the love of stories but was real and sustaining and deeply mourned. "I don't think I expected to fall in love the way it happens in books," she told him one Wednesday evening in late October, while the wind came hard against the window and Rosie slept in the next room and they sat by the fire with their coffee. "I thought I knew what kind of person I was, practical, clear-eyed, and then she stopped." He waited. "And then I find myself sitting in my kitchen looking at a man who walked across a saloon because of a reel on a piano and asked again when I said no, and I think I might have been wrong about what kind of person I am." The fire popped. The wind moved against the house. Jonas set down his cup. "For what it's worth," he said, "I walked across that saloon because you laughed. I heard you laugh from halfway across the room and I turned around before I knew I was turning. That's not something I've done in a very long time." She looked at him. The firelight was warm on her face. "How long?" she asked softly. He told her then. About Clara Hennessy and the harvest dance in 1872 and the April morning, and the 11 years of seasons he had moved through since, putting one foot in front of the other across an enormous quantity of prairie, without once turning in the direction of what he was missing. It was the first time he had told anyone the full version of it, and the telling felt both harder and lighter than he expected, the way long-carried things do when you finally set them down. Adelaide did not say she was sorry, which was the response he would have least wanted. She said, "She would have been glad you're here now, I think, if she was the kind of person worth being glad for." It was exactly the right thing to say. He could feel in the precise way she said it that she had thought about it rather than reached for it, and the thought had been kind and careful and particular to him rather than general. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked down at their hands and then up at him, and neither of them moved for a long moment, and the fire burned, and the wind pulled at the house, and outside the October prairie was cold and wide and full of stars. He did not kiss her that evening. He was not ready to rush anything, and more importantly, he did not think she was. But when he stood at her door to leave, and she pulled her shawl tighter against the cold air coming in and said good night, he held her gaze a beat longer than he had before, and she held his, And between them in the cold doorway was something that neither of them needed to name yet, but both of them could feel. November in Caldwell arrived with the seriousness of a season that means business. The temperature dropped hard in the first week, a norther coming down from the plains that turned the streets muddy, and then froze the mud into ruts that persisted for days. The cattle drives had ended for the year, and the town went through the particular quiet that follows the end of the season. Fewer strangers, more familiar faces, the rhythms of a settled community reasserting themselves over the noise of commerce. Jonas spent his mornings at the Carver Creek property and his afternoons in town, increasingly drawn into the fabric of Caldwell in ways he had not anticipated. He had lunch at the hotel dining room and encountered the same faces daily. He stopped to talk with Thomas Greer at the carpenter's shop when he needed timber, and Thomas Greer turned out to be the kind of man who becomes a friend without ceremony, without drama, simply by the steady, reliable fact of his presence and good humor. He attended church on Sundays, not from any deep religious conviction, but because Adelaide attended and Rosie sat on his other side and kicked her small feet against the pew in a way that Adelaide tried to stop and Jonas quietly encouraged by pretending not to notice. He was, without having planned it precisely this way, becoming part of something. And Adelaide Wilcox was, without either of them having to speak it aloud just yet, becoming the center of it. He was working on the floor of the back room one cold November morning when Friedrich Holst, prying up a particularly rotten board, said without looking up from his work, "She is a good woman, that one." Jonas kept working. "She is. She has had a hard time of it," Friedrich said. "Coming here alone with that child, working at that store for what Calloway pays, which is not enough. She does not complain. I think she cannot afford to." Jonas looked up from the floor. Friedrich was not a man who said things without meaning to say them. "What does Calloway pay?" he asked. Friedrich named a figure. It was modest, even by the standards of 1883, and even accounting for the fact that she worked only 3 mornings a week. He knew the money her husband had left was finite and thinning. He had not asked about it directly because it was not his place yet, but the information from Friedrich settled in him like a cold stone. He was not a wealthy man. He had the land and what remained of the pay from 11 seasons of trail work, a reasonable sum, saved carefully over years of living without much to spend it on, and the cattle he intended to buy in the spring. He was not rich, but he was solid, and he was intending to build something solider still, and the thought of Adelaide watching her money thin through another Kansas winter, while he built a house on 30 acres of good prairie, was one he found he was not willing to sit with for long. He said nothing to Adelaide about this directly. He was not the kind of man who made his consideration of another person's circumstances into a transaction, and he was not going to do that here. But he began to think more seriously and more concretely about what he was building and why, and toward what end. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in late November when she was showing him the kitchen garden she planned to put in the following spring. The small fenced plot behind the house that was hard and bare now with frost, but which she had marked out with stakes and string, planning the rows with the same precise intelligence she brought to everything. She was telling him about what she intended to plant and gesturing with her hands in the way she did when she was animated about something. And the late afternoon light was low and golden on the dry grass and on her face, and Jonas stopped listening to the words and just looked at her for a moment, and she caught him looking and stopped talking, and the silence between them was full and certain, and he took one step toward her and she did not step back. And he put his hand along the side of her face and she turned into it slightly and he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. He was through with tentative. It was the kiss of a man who knows what he wants and has finally allowed himself to reach for it. And Adelaide kissed him back with a wholeness and a warmth that told him everything he needed to know about what she felt. And when they separated, the golden November air was between them, and Adelaide was looking up at him with her eyes very bright. "I've been expecting that for some time," she said, which was such an Adelaide thing to say that he laughed and she laughed too, and it was the most natural sound in the world. "I should have done it sooner," he said. "No," she said. "You should have done it exactly when you did." He proposed to her in December on the 21st of the month, which was the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, and he had chosen the date with deliberateness, because it seemed right, the darkest point, and then the turning, the days beginning to lengthen again from here. He came to her house on a Sunday afternoon, and Rosie was there, building something complicated out of pine cones on the parlor floor. And Jonas had thought about whether to ask Adelaide privately first, and then include Rosie, or whether to include Rosie from the start. And he had decided on the latter because Rosie was part of the proposition in the most essential way. He sat down on the floor across from Rosie and her pine cones, which earned him a suspicious look from the child. "Rosie," he said, "I want to ask your mother something important, and I wanted to ask you first." Rosie set down her pinecone. Adelaide, standing in the kitchen doorway, went very still. "What?" Rosie said. "I'd like to marry your mother," he said, "and I'd like to be your father if you'd have me, if that's something you'd want." Rosie looked at him with her serious round face. Then she looked at her mother. Then she looked back at Jonas. "Would we live at your house?" she asked. "The one with the yellow trees?" He had taken them out to the Carver Creek property twice, and Rosie had been enchanted by the cottonwoods in their autumn colors. "Yes," he said, "the one with the yellow trees, though they'll be bare now and full again in spring." Another pause. Then Rosie picked up her pinecone again with the air of a child who has reached her decision and considers the matter settled. "All right," she said. He stood up and looked at Adelaide, who was still in the doorway. Her eyes were bright, and she was pressing her lips together in a way that was not unhappiness, but was the attempt to contain something large. "Adelaide," he said. He had a ring in his coat pocket, a simple gold band he had bought from a jeweler in Wichita when he had ridden up to arrange some business there. A plain, honest ring, because Adelaide was a plain, honest woman and would not have wanted anything else. He took it out and held it in his palm. "I have not wanted anything as much as I want this," he said. "I'm asking you to marry me. I'm asking you to come to the Carver Creek house and be my wife and bring Rosie and plant your kitchen garden and live your life with me. I know I'm asking a great deal. I think you know already that I intend to deserve it." The bright thing in Adelaide's eyes became more than bright. She crossed the parlor to him and took the ring from his palm and looked at it, and then she looked up at him and she said, "Yes, Jonas, of course." He put the ring on her finger. His hands were for the first time actually shaking, and she noticed and wrapped her hands around his. "You're shaking," she said softly. "I know," he said. "That's good," she said. "It means it matters." Rosie from the floor said, "Are you going to kiss now?" with the resigned air of someone who knows the answer. They were. They were married in February of 1884, on a cold, clear Saturday, in the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, with Thomas and Martha Greer as their witnesses, and a good portion of the town in the pews, because Adelaide was well regarded, and because Caldwell was not so large that a wedding did not constitute community news of the warmest kind. The minister was a short, earnest man named Reverend Albright, who had married a lot of people in his time, but handled the particulars of each ceremony with fresh sincerity. And when he said the words and Jonas said his and Adelaide said hers, Rosie sat in the front pew between Martha Greer and Friedrich Holst, who had been invited as a matter of genuine regard, and held her wooden horse in her lap, and watched with large solemn eyes as the thing she had agreed to in December was formally accomplished. Adelaide wore a dress she had made herself from good ivory-colored wool, very simple, with her brown hair up and a small spray of winter-dried flowers from Martha's garden pinned at her shoulder. And she was the most beautiful thing Jonas had ever looked at in his life, and he told her so in front of the entire congregation when the moment came that he was supposed to say his vows, and he began instead with, "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever looked at in my life," which caused a murmur of approval from the pews and a slight blush from Adelaide, and a grin from Thomas Greer that threatened to consume the lower half of his face. They moved into the Carver Creek house in the last week of February. The house was not finished in every particular. There were boards still needing painting, and a porch Jonas had planned but not yet built. But the essential parts of it were right. The roof was sound, the walls were whole, the floors were smooth, and there was a kitchen range that Friedrich had helped Jonas install that threw out enough heat to warm the whole structure on even the coldest mornings. Adelaide's things came from her house in town in a wagon that Thomas Greer drove out with cheerful efficiency, and Rosie directed the unloading of each box and crate with the managerial authority of a small general. And by evening the house smelled of the things Adelaide had brought with her, the particular combination of wood polish and cinnamon, and the faint lavender she kept in her linen. And it smelled, for the first time in Jonas's experience of it, like a home. That first night, after Rosie was asleep in her new room with the wooden horse on the windowsill and the wind was working at the house from the northwest and the kitchen range was warm, they sat together at the kitchen table with their hands across the grain of the wood, the lamp burning between them, and Adelaide said, "How does it feel?" "Impossible," Jonas said honestly. "I keep waiting for it to feel familiar. It doesn't yet. It just feels very large." "That's how it felt when Rosie was born," Adelaide said. "Very large, like something too big to hold but you don't have a choice." He turned her hand over in his and traced the ring on her finger. "I want to do this right," he said. "Everything, the land, the cattle, this house, I want to do right by all of it." "You already are," she said. "You started doing right by it the moment you walked across that saloon floor." He looked at her. The lamp made her face golden. "You said no," he reminded her. "And you laughed," she said, and asked again. "That's how I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were worth saying yes to." He stood up from the table and held out his hand to her in the exact gesture he had made that first night in the Dusty Rose, and she looked at the offered hand and then up at him with a smile that was entirely for him, with nothing held back. "There's no music," she said. "There doesn't need to be," he said. She took his hand and he drew her up, and they danced there in the kitchen of the Carver Creek house on the first night of their life together, in the February cold of 1884, with the wind against the windows and the lamp throwing their shadows long across the walls and the prairie stretching away in every direction into the dark, vast and quiet and full of possibility. Spring came to the Kansas prairie the way it always did, violently and beautifully, the grass going from brown to green in what seemed like a matter of days, the meadowlarks returning with their outrageous liquid song, the creek filling and running fast and cold from the snowmelt upstream. It flooded, as promised and as expected, a 4-day rise in April that spread across the lower meadow but came no closer to the house than Jonas had planned, the grade doing exactly the work he had intended, and when it receded it left the meadow grass dark and rich and laden with the particular fertility that floods carry with them. And Jonas stood at the house looking at it, with the satisfaction of a man whose calculation has proved correct. Adelaide planted her kitchen garden in May with a thoroughness that suggested she had been thinking about it all winter, which she had. Tomatoes and beans and 2 kinds of squash and onions, and a row of sunflowers along the south fence that were technically not food but were, Adelaide declared firmly, essential nonetheless. Rosie helped with the planting in the way that a 5-year-old helps, with great enthusiasm and inconsistent utility, and Jonas helped by building the fence higher to keep the rabbits out, which was his most practical contribution. He rode to Wichita in April and came back with 40 head of longhorn cattle, which was a beginning and nothing more, and he and Billy Prout, who had stayed on through the winter, and who Jonas had found to be capable and honest and increasingly skilled at the work, drove them out to the Carver Creek range and set them on the new spring grass and watched them settle in with the contentment of animals who have found good ground. The life took shape around him with a naturalness that still surprised him daily. He rose early and went to the range and worked through the morning, And Adelaide had breakfast on the table when he came in and coffee ready and Rosie at the table with her lessons or her pinecones or her many strong opinions. And in the evenings they sat by the fire or at the kitchen table and talked or read. Adelaide with her books and Jonas with the newspapers that came into town on the mail coach. And the sounds of the house were the sounds of a family, Rosie's voice, and the fire's voice and the wind's voice, and underneath it all the quiet continuous sound of two people at ease with each other. He fell more in love with her every week. It was not the falling of early courtship, which is fast and blind and wonderful and also somewhat terrifying. It was something steadier and deeper, the discovery, through daily proximity, of the person Adelaide Wilcox actually was, in all the ordinary particular ways that daily proximity reveals. He learned that she woke up easily and completely, unlike him, who needed 15 minutes and 2 cups of coffee to be a reasonable human being. He learned that she had a sharp and entirely unexpected sense of humor that was mostly kept quiet, but emerged at odd moments with the force of a hidden spring. He learned that she was almost always right about practical matters, and that she said so without either crowing about it or apologizing for it, and that this quality in her, which might in theory have been difficult to live with, was in practice something he found entirely admirable. He learned that she cried at almost nothing in daily life and quite readily at books, and that she considered this entirely consistent and not contradictory. He learned that she loved him. Not from declarations. She was not a declaratory person in that way, but from the specific texture of her attention to him, the way she tracked where he was in the house without appearing to, the way she registered his moods before he had himself, and adjusted the space between them accordingly, moving closer when he was tired and needing company, giving him room when he needed quiet, with an accuracy that suggested she had been paying very close attention all along. The summer of 1884 was long and golden and full. Thomas and Martha Greer came out to the Carver Creek property in July, and they had a proper supper on the new porch that Jonas had finally finished in June, and sat in the evening air while the fireflies came up from the grass along the creek, and Rosie ran after them with a jar and her tremendous purposeful energy. And Martha said to Adelaide something quiet that Jonas didn't hear, and Adelaide laughed. And the sound of her laugh in the summer evening on his own porch was the finest sound Jonas Ellsworth had ever heard in his life. He told her so later, lying in the dark with the summer night coming through the open window and the creek audible in the stillness. "You have a remarkable laugh," he said. "You've mentioned that," she said. "I heard it from across a saloon full of noise and turned around without thinking," he said. "I want you to know I think about that sometimes. What would have happened if I hadn't turned?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think about what would have happened if I hadn't changed my answer." "What made you change it?" he asked. It was a question he had thought about but never directly posed. She considered. "You laughed," she said. "You asked me to dance and I said no, and instead of leaving or being embarrassed or trying to talk me around, you laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. And then you asked again, and there was something in the asking that was not desperate, not performing, just genuine, like you actually wanted to dance with me specifically, not just to not be standing at the bar anymore." "I did," he said. "I absolutely did." "I know," she said. "That's why I said yes." He put his arm around her, and she settled into his side with the ease of someone who has learned over months that this is where she fits. And the creek ran in the dark, and the summer night pressed warm against the house. And Jonas Ellsworth lay awake for a while after she fell asleep, and thought about all the years and all the miles between the man he had been in 1872 and the man lying here now in a house he had built on land he owned with a woman he loved and a child who had told him the following week after he moved in, with enormous casualness, that she was going to call him Papa from now on because it was easier, and had done so ever since without discussion. 11 years. He had carried those years like a stone in his chest, not knowing he was carrying them. And then a woman had laughed across a noisy room, and the stone had been gone so gradually, He had not noticed it leaving until one morning he had reached for it out of habit and found only clean open space. In October of 1884, Adelaide told him she was expecting their child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning before Rosie was up, and she told him in the matter-of-fact way she told him most things, but with a brightness underneath it that she was not quite suppressing. And Jonas sat down in his chair at the kitchen table because his knees had made it necessary. And he looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood back up and went around the table and held her with both arms, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood there in the morning kitchen while the range ticked with warmth and the early light came through the east window. "Are you happy?" she said, muffled against his shoulder. "Adelaide," he said, "I cannot tell you how happy." He felt her exhale against him in the way of something long held being released. "Good," she said. "Me too." The winter passed with the particular sweet weight of a winter that contains something being waited for. Jonas worked through the cold months on improvements to the property, a proper barn, finally, which Friedrich Holst helped design, and Billy Prout helped raise over the course of 3 weeks in November, and which the cattle were extremely grateful for by the time the first hard freeze came in December. Adelaide's pregnancy proceeded without significant difficulty, which was both a relief and a thing Jonas tried not to take for granted, knowing as he did from experience and from the plain facts of the time and place that this was not something to be assumed. Martha Greer came out to the property twice a week through the winter months, not because she was asked to, but because she was Martha and this was what Martha did. And the two women sat in the warm kitchen and talked and sewed and laughed, and the house felt, on those afternoons, so full of life that Jonas sometimes came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway just for a moment before announcing himself, just to take the sound of it in. Rosie was aware of the coming baby in the way 6-year-olds are aware of large events, not quite comprehending the whole of it but very certain about her own position in relation to it, which was that the baby would be coming into Rosie's house and using Rosie's things and would require Rosie's supervision, and she communicated this position clearly and regularly to all parties. "She's going to be extraordinary," Adelaide said one evening, watching Rosie lecture General the chicken through the kitchen window with comprehensive authority. "She already is," Jonas said. "She gets it from her father," Adelaide said. He looked at her. "Thomas," she looked back at him. "You," she said. And the word was so quiet and so certain that it went straight through him to the center. He was Jonas Ellsworth of Carver Creek, and this was his family. Their son was born in the last week of March 1885, on a wild spring night when the creek was running high, and the rain hammered the roof, and Martha Greer was there as she had promised she would be. Jonas was in the kitchen because he had been firmly directed there, pacing the length of the room in a pattern that Billy Prout, who had stayed the night in the barn rather than ride back to town in the rain, could have mapped from the sounds of his footsteps. Rosie sat at the kitchen table in her nightgown eating a biscuit with the focused calm of someone who has decided that the correct response to uncertainty is food. When the cry came from the bedroom, the first cry, new and furious and absolutely alive, Jonas stopped pacing and put one hand flat on the kitchen table and lowered his head and breathed. Rosie said, "That's the baby." "Yes," he said. His voice came out rough. Martha appeared in the doorway. "Come see your son," she said. He was a boy of good size and loud opinions, red-faced and thoroughly displeased with the proceedings, as newborns often are, and Adelaide lay in the bed with her hair loose and her face exhausted and radiant in equal measure, and she looked up at Jonas with the baby in her arms and said, "His name is Thomas," for her late husband's name. Jonas had known she was considering it and had already told her he thought it right. He looked at the child, at Thomas Jonas Ellsworth, as they would write in the record, and felt something so enormous and undifferentiated that he could not have called it by a single name. It contained love and terror and gratitude and wonder in proportions that kept shifting, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the three people who were his life, and knew that he was not the man who had ridden into Caldwell in September of 1883 with nothing but a horse and a bag and 11 years of emptiness. He was someone entirely different. He was someone who had begun. The years that followed built themselves with the slow accumulation of good lives, not without difficulty, because no life is, but with a consistent underlying rightness that Jonas did not take for granted for a single day. A second child, a daughter they called Clara after the girl Jonas had loved and lost in 1872, came in 1887, and Adelaide had suggested the name herself one evening without being asked, which told Jonas everything about the quality of her heart. A third child, another boy named William after Adelaide's father, came in 1889, and by that time the Carver Creek property was no longer a modest beginning but a working ranch of substance, with 120 head of cattle and a bunkhouse for 3 hired hands and a barn that Friedrich Holst declared was the best work of his Kansas years. The town of Caldwell grew and changed around them, as prairie towns did in those years, the cattle trail quieting as the railroads and the homestead fences changed the character of the land and the commerce. Some people left as the boom contracted. Others stayed and put their roots down deeper. Jonas and Adelaide stayed, rooted so thoroughly into the Carver Creek ground that the question of leaving simply did not arise. Rosie grew into a young woman of remarkable force of character, who at 16 argued with the schoolteacher about historical inaccuracies with such comprehensive preparation that the schoolteacher wrote a letter to Adelaide saying that her daughter was either going to be a great success or a great trouble and possibly both, which Adelaide read aloud to Jonas over breakfast, and which they both found entirely accurate. Thomas grew tall and easy-mannered, and was early identified as the kind of boy who could be trusted to do what he said he would do, which was in Jonas's private estimation the most important quality a person could have. Clara was her father's daughter in every way that made Jonas simultaneously proud and concerned. She had his stubbornness, and his habit of making things harder than they needed to be, and his absolute inability to do anything in a small way. William was quiet and thoughtful and showed, by the time he was 5, a precision with numbers that made Adelaide certain he would find his way to something involving figures, which proved to be correct when he grew up. Jonas built the porch bigger in 1888 to accommodate the family that had outgrown the original one. He painted the house white in 1890 because Adelaide had always thought white houses were the finest kind, and the color against the gold prairie grass in autumn was everything she had said it would be. The cottonwoods along the creek grew taller every year, and in October they were as gold as anything in the world, and the creek still flooded in the springs, and the house still stood clear of it on its raised grade, exactly as Jonas had planned on the day he walked the property in 1883 with Hartley Oak's nervous voice in his ear. Friedrich Holst died in 1891 and Jonas, and the whole family went to the funeral in town, and Jonas carried the coffin with Thomas Greer and 2 other men, and felt the loss with the genuine weight of a man burying someone who had helped him build his life, in the most literal sense possible. Billy Prout married a girl from Wichita and brought her back to Caldwell, and eventually bought his own small piece of land south of the Ellsworth property, and the 2 families were neighborly in the way that neighbors become family over years of helping each other through the unpredictable seasons of the prairie. Thomas Greer and Martha remained their dearest friends through all of it, and on a July evening in 1892, 8 years after that first supper on the original small porch, the 4 of them sat on the big new porch of the Carver Creek house, while the children ran in the summer grass, and the fireflies came up from the creek as they always did, and Martha said the same quiet thing to Adelaide that she had said that evening 8 years before, and Adelaide laughed in exactly the same way. and the sound of it moved across the summer evening and reached Jonas where he sat talking with Thomas Greer, and he stopped mid-sentence. Thomas Greer looked at him and grinned. "Still." "Every time," Jonas said. "Good man," Thomas Greer said, and meant it absolutely. There was a harvest celebration in Caldwell in the fall of 1892, the town's first formal harvest dance in several years. Held in the meeting hall with the same Cal Dawson's fiddle. Cal was older now, slower, but still enthusiastic, and the same kind of paper lanterns and the same long tables. And the whole community came because a harvest dance is the kind of thing a community needs, and Caldwell was wise enough to know it. Adelaide wore the green wool dress she had worn the night Jonas first saw her in the dusty rose, still in excellent condition because she had taken care of it, and when she came into the hall on his arm, the familiarity of that green against the warm lamplight landed on Jonas with a force that was both old and new at once. She saw him register it. "I thought you might remember it," she said. "I'll always remember it," he said. Cal Dawson's fiddle started up something bright and quick, a reel with the same character as the one Clarence had played that September night in 1883, and Jonas held out his hand to Adelaide. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said. She looked at his offered hand and at his face, and she laughed her laugh, the one he had first heard across a noisy room, and turned toward before he knew he was turning, and she took his hand. "You don't have to ask twice anymore," she said. "I know," he said, "but I like to ask you things. I always like your answers." She stepped into his arms and they went out onto the floor together, and the music was around them, and the community was around them. And across the room Rosie was dancing with a young man from the far end of the county who was clearly terrified of her in the best possible way. And Thomas was sitting on a bench with his boots stretched out eating something, as he always was, and Clara was spinning too fast and laughing too loud, as she always did, and somewhere William was counting something. Probably the musician's notes, which was the sort of thing William did. And Jonas Ellsworth danced with his wife in the lamplight of a Kansas harvest hall. 11 years of emptiness become 11 years of the fullest possible life, every step of the real familiar now and joyful. And Adelaide moved with him with all her particular grace and her particular certainty and her dark eyes bright. And the fiddle played, and the autumn night pressed warm and close against the walls, and outside the prairie spread away in every direction under the wide Kansas sky. Under the same stars that had watched him ride into Caldwell 9 years ago with nothing but a horse and a history he was still carrying, toward a woman he had not yet heard laugh. He had not asked a woman to dance in 11 years. She had said no, and he had laughed and asked again, and she had said yes, and from that yes, everything, all of it. The ring and the house and the white walls against the autumn grass, and the children growing tall on good prairie air, and the kitchen in the morning with the range warm and the coffee ready, and most of all Adelaide herself, Adelaide clear-eyed and honest and sharp and warm, with her precise questions and her quiet humor and her extraordinary particular laugh. His wife, his partner, the woman who had said no and then yes, and had meant both with equal certainty. He held her close as the reel resolved into something slower, a waltz with Cal's fiddle gentled to a sweeter register, and Adelaide settled her head against his shoulder the way she had learned to do years ago in the kitchen of the Carver Creek house on the first night of their life together, and Jonas pressed his cheek to the top of her head and thought, "This, all of this. This is every mile worth riding, and every year worth carrying, and every silence worth breaking, and every risk worth taking, and every laugh worth turning toward. What are you thinking?" she said softly against his shoulder, because she always knew when he was somewhere large in his head. He thought about how to say it and then decided to just say it because that was always better, because he was the man who had learned to say the thing. "That I'm the luckiest man on the Kishom Trail," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him. "You're the only man on the Kishom Trail," she said. "It's a harvest dance in Caldwell." "I know," he said. "Still true." She shook her head at him with the specific expression she had for his occasional sentimental flourishes: fond, wry, entirely warm. And then she put her head back against his shoulder, and they kept dancing, slow and easy and together, while the fiddle played and the lamplight held and the harvest evening wrapped itself around them, and the Kansas prairie stretched away outside into the wide and starlit dark. In the years that came after, and there were many good years, long and full and rich with the particular texture of a life built rather than stumbled into, Jonas would sometimes stop in the middle of an ordinary day and simply notice what was around him. The smell of the kitchen in the morning, the sound of Clara arguing with William about something purely theoretical, the way Adelaide looked in the garden in the late afternoon light, kneeling between her tomato rows with her gloves off because she said she could not feel the soil properly through gloves, and feeling the soil was half the point. The way the cottonwoods turned gold in October every year and reflected in the creek, the same every year and every year different, and he never got tired of it, not once. He thought sometimes about the man he had been in September of 1883, riding into town at the end of 6 weeks on the trail, intending nothing more than a drink and a bed, carrying without knowing it 11 years of carefully maintained emptiness. He thought about what it had taken to cross that saloon floor, what small accumulation of courage, what crack in the long-maintained armor of a man who has learned not to reach for things. A laugh. Just a laugh, heard across a noisy room, that had turned him around before he could think about turning. And then a woman clear-eyed and honest who had said no with perfect composure, and had not said it out of cruelty or coyness, but out of the plain, straightforward dignity of a person who knows her own mind, and had then said yes for exactly the same reason when the question turned out to deserve a different answer. The cottonwoods grew taller every year. The house stood solid and white on its raised ground above the floodplain. The cattle on the rolling prairie grass were fat and content in the way of animals on good ground. Rosie married her terrified young man from the county's far end, and eventually came to live 6 miles south of the Carver Creek property, and brought her children to visit on Sundays the way Thomas and Martha used to come calling, the generations cycling forward in the way of families that take root and hold. Thomas grew into the steadiest man Jonas had ever known outside of himself, and Clara was extraordinary and troublesome in equal measure as predicted, and William went east eventually to study accounting and sent long letters home full of numbers and affection. And Adelaide was there. She was always there. She was the fixed point around which everything else turned, the still center of it all, not passive, never passive, but present in the most essential way, the way a load-bearing wall is present, quiet and strong and absolutely necessary. And Jonas loved her every day with the same astonishment he had felt on the night she had said yes, and he had taken her hand on the saloon floor. That first dance in the amber lamplight with Clarence's piano playing something bright and fast, and the world rearranging itself around the simple fact of her willingness. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, February of 1904, they sat on the wide porch of the Carver Creek house in the cold air wrapped in heavy coats, because Adelaide had said she wanted to sit outside on the porch on their anniversary and look at the stars, and Jonas would have sat in a blizzard if she asked. And the sky was extraordinary, a full winter sky over the Kansas plain, dense with stars. The kind of sky that reminds you how large the world is and how small you are in it, and why that is, somehow, not a frightening thing but a beautiful one. Adelaide sat in the chair beside him with her hand in his, the gold ring on her finger, and they sat in comfortable quiet for a long time, the way people do who have had so many conversations that silence between them has become its own kind of language. 20 years, he said finally. 20 years, she agreed. Adelaide, he said. She turned and looked at him in the starlight. Her hair was threaded with silver now, and her face held more years than the face he had first seen across a saloon, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever looked at, still, exactly as she had been on the day he married her, exactly as she had been on the night she said yes. "What is it?" she said, because she always knew when he was somewhere important. "I just wanted to say it," he said. "I love you. I've loved you since the night you turned down my first request and accepted my second, and I have loved you every day since then, and I will love you every day that follows, and I'm glad every single day that I heard you laugh across that room and turned around." She looked at him under the winter stars over the prairie they had made their home, and she squeezed his hand. "Jonas Ellsworth," she said, with the full particular warmth she had always given his name, "I am going to love you until there is no more of either of us to do the loving with." He turned her hand over and brought it to his mouth and held it there, and the stars burned overhead, and the cold prairie air was sweet and vast and still, and the creek ran in the dark below the cottonwoods, year-round and faithful, the way it always had, the way it always would, and the house stood white and solid on its good ground, full of the life they had built in it. And Jonas Ellsworth and Adelaide Wilcox Ellsworth sat together in the winter night, and were, in every way that counted, entirely and completely home.